Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today is a huge one. We're about to have a mojito with David Grann. You might know him from his work with The New Yorker, where he's been a staff writer since 2003. Or you might know him from his 2009 debut, The Lost City of Z, which on the back of strong word of mouth climbed to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Or you might know him from his book, Killers of the Flower Moon. And I remember seeing some photos on social media of David on the movie set along with Scorsese and Dicaprio, who brought that terrific book to the big screen. Or you might know him from his most recent book, The Wager, which is a story of an 18th century shipwreck. I am holding up here a first edition of the hardcover, but as of now, it is available in paperback. So if you are not one of the millions of people who have devoured that book, go get it now. And if all of that isn't enough to make the writers out there burning with jealousy, guess who has the movie option for The Wager? Scorsese and Dicaprio are back for more of David Grann, and I can't wait for it. David, welcome to the show.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that intro.
Oh, well, I'm thrilled you're here. I loved The Wager. Speaking of jealousy, I have to tell you, this came out in April of 23. So,
Yes.
by the way, waiting 2 years in hardcover is huge. That means it's selling very well if you wait that long for paperback. But that summer, I was walking down the beach, and in my own life, I've always imagined that, and this has never happened, the experience of being in the wild, and as they say, and having someone reading your book and you run it. So in my mind, I'm going to walk on the plane one day and the person's going to sit down next to me and reach in their bag and pull out a copy of my book. And then I'm going to be all coy and say, oh, how do you like that? And that is me in the photo, but that's never happened to me. But on that one little 30-yard walk on the beach, I saw 4 people reading The Wager in their beach chairs. I'm like, my God, Grann is killing it.
Well, it is my terror. I had a friend who actually once did this, who went up to someone reading their book and said, well, what do you think? Oh, this book is just the worst. So if I would be terrified to actually ask anyone reading my book. But I will say the one good thing about reading The Wager, if you're reading it on a beach, you will feel a lot better about your own life.
Right, you're not stranded in the south.
Stranded on a desolate island, starving, suffering scurvy. So it can't be all that bad.
It is, so it really does take you there. Now, I'm going to start, you picked the Mojito as I reference, which I will.
I figure it's freezing out, and what's kind of like a summery drink. I'm kind of out of place here.
Yeah, this is.
And I should have asked. Oh, and you got some lime, which is good, so it'll keep the scurvy away.
That's if only those poor saps in Chile had that. All right, so we've got some simple syrup, some mint leaves, and both some lime juice and some lime. So we're going to do a bit of both of that while I do this. And then we get to muddle, which is fun.
I'm very impressed by this, by the way. I don't know writers that can make a drink. I just thought writers drink.
A bit of both. I was a bartender for a little while. And here comes the muddling, which is cool. Yeah, so is this your, if you're at a dinner, you get the Mojito? Or
I do. I like the Mojito. I like those kind of Latin drinks.
All right. Now, I have a whole bunch of questions for you on your background because I know we were just talking before we got started here that you are from this area. Your mom was the first woman CEO of a big publisher?
Yes, she was. She rose to be head of Putnam, and then later she moved to Penguin. And yeah, she was the first. She was a woman, obviously an editor, and was often the first of the kind of major New York publishing houses, first time editor-in-chief, and then later of a CEO. She broke a lot of glass ceilings.
I bet you when I first got to Simon & Schuster, it was Carolyn Reedy, who was a very powerful, well-respected woman CEO at S&S. So your mom paved the way.
She paved the way, and the funny thing is, there's 2 things. One is I got to be exposed to writers when I was young. Judy Blume and Dick Francis. So, there were all these writers around us. So to me, they were always these kind of distant stars or these people I admired. But my mom only gave me one piece of advice. She said, whatever you do, don't become a writer. And so I, like every good son, decided to prove her wrong and became one. I think she thought it would be too hard a life.
She passed, I guess.
My mom, no, she's still alive.
She's still here? Okay,
she's still
great.
Here. Yep.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, so she's seen all of this happen.
She finally, I wrote so many books, and this is a true story. It's it's slightly mortifying, but she finally read Killers of the Flower Moon, and she finished it, and she said to me, "Well, I guess it was okay that you became a writer." Like finally, I don't know how old I was, 40 something by then.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, cheers.
Salud. Thank you.
Great to see you.
It's good.
That is good. It's the first mojito on the show, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So your mom at Penguin Putnam, and then your dad's an oncologist up in Connecticut.
So my dad has passed, but he was an oncologist and practiced in Stanford, a hematologist and oncologist.
And so you grew up high school in Connecticut?
I grew up high school in Connecticut, grew up in Westport, Connecticut.
And then Connecticut College, I read as well.
Then I went to Connecticut College into London. I was always like, can I ever get out of the state of Connecticut? I never quite made it. Then when I finally crossed the border into Rhode Island, it was a big deal.
I just saw this article went out recently that the stretch of 95 between Stamford and Greenwich is the busiest corridor of any highway in the country. It was number one.
I know that corridor way too well.
Yeah.
And yes, and one would be shocked in a small state like Connecticut how much traffic there is on that corridor.
It's maddening, and like no rhyme or reason to it. You could be 3 o'clock on a Sunday, you'd think it should be all quiet, and it's backed up like 8 a.m. on a Monday. It's terrible.
The only good thing is to listen to Audiobooks or rework a sentence in your mind.
Now, so I also read that, so you got your master's in international relations at Tufts.
Yes.
And there was some article I read that said you were also thinking you might be a novelist around this time.
Yeah. So I actually did a master's degree in creative writing at BU, and I tried my hand at fiction, and I was really bad at it. I have a novel that is now sitting in an attic, being eaten only by probably mice, and thankfully has never been read by pretty much anybody.
When did you write that?
Oh, I wrote that about a year out of college, when I was living in Mexico, and I wrote that. And, I realized at a certain point that I lacked the imagination of a novelist. I couldn't, invent the dialogue. I couldn't really fully imagine the people. I struggled to come up with the plots. And then at a certain point, when I kind of was forced to get a job, so I became a reporter, and I started to stumble upon these stories. And you're listening to these stories, and you're like, oh my gosh, here's a plot. Here's a real person. Oh my gosh, they're telling me what they said to each other, or there's a recording or a video. I can I have the dialogue right there. And then I could take the literary techniques of, building a story around narrative, around human beings, but the story was provided for me. And so I realized that, my talent, if I had one, was not in kind of inventing stories, but really excavating them. And so that's kind of what I did.
You have the instincts to tell it in a novelistic way, but the scaffolding is all there. And then, of course, the research is a talent unto itself.
And the research, and that's why the research takes so long. And people are always like, books take so long. Yeah. They take about half, I always round them down, and my wife always says I'm cheating a little bit. I'm not fact checking myself, but I like to just say half a decade the wager took, and the Killers of the Flower Moon took half a decade. But part of that is just to reconstruct them in that vivid way, to kind of know what the wind was like, how big were the waves, figuring out what their house looked like, what was the sun doing that day, defying the bits of dialogue buried in diaries to get as close to other people's consciousness as you can, just requires endless research. And I will say there are a lot of stories I come across that seem fantastic, but I quickly look into them and I realize there's not enough material to tell them. That
minutia that you're describing there, like where the sun was, it sounds small, but the way it washes over you as the reader, it really takes you there. You don't even realize you're getting like, this sort of granular level, but it paints the picture in a way that's almost subliminal to you. You just sort of are transported there as a reader.
Well, the other thing I realized at a certain point too was, and especially as I started to tell stories and more historical stories and looking back at the past, you have the power of hindsight. So you gather the records and you kind of know what happened because, you're looking back sometimes 100 years, 200 years, 50 years, whatever, or maybe even a few months. But you kind of know how the story played out. And one way to tell the story would be kind of like the arrogance of a godlike narrator who kind of knows exactly the end of the mystery. It'd be like a detective story where the detective just knows everything before it happened. And I realized that's not the way we live history. You know, that's not the way we experience life. We don't know how this conversation is going to go. When I head out the door that day, I don't know what's going to happen. If you're on the ship, like on the Wager, you don't know what's going to happen the next day or even the next minute, literally. Yeah. And so I think part of the power of the stories that always drew me were the ones where you can tell history as it's unfolding and through the people that are experiencing it. And that's the way they experience history, and that's the way we experience life. Yeah,
to sort of recreate that sense of uncertainty about what's next, and that builds the tension.
Life is a mystery. People sometimes say, "Well, how do you create mysteries in your stories?" And I said, "Well, no, life is a mystery. In fact, the reason I write is try to make sense of my own mysteries of my own existence by looking at these past mysteries. But, the human existence is a great riddle."
Yeah. And it's, your technique in doing it is fantastic. We were just talking about Eric Larson, who was here, and you guys are buddies.
Master. Yeah.
And,
when I first decided to do this, it was the first person I did was, okay, let me go read Eric Larson and say, how does he do? Because I hadn't done these kind of historical narratives. Okay, how does he do this?
Yeah, it's great. And the one example I was going to raise, which I think he and I may have talked about a bit, but Dead Wake, about the Lusitania and the submarine that sinks it. We know the story. We know how it ends. So even the reader knows, where this is going. And yet he creates that sort of sense of uncertainty and tension, and in some weird way through his technique, knowing the end almost builds the tension even more so.
It can be true. I mean, even with the Wager, for example, to some extent, even from the prologue, this is going to be a calamity and it's not going to end well and it's going to end in shipwreck. Mm-hmm. And so they're setting out. And so you do have this sense that, okay, this is impending doom. But each of these people, as they're getting on the ship and then embarking on the ship and going into a hurricane attack, they never know that. And so you have the suspense that they're going through with that kind of foreboding sense going, oh no, I do know that sometime this is not going to end well.
Yeah. I have a whole section on process I want to get into in a bit. But before that, going back to your early years when you were, paying the rent and the grocery bill. So you were working for The Hill and the New Republic, covering Congress and politics and things like that.
Yeah. I needed a job. And I was a failed novelist. I was never earning any living as a fiction. I had tried different things. I had taught 7th and 8th grade. I once had a full head of hair, and then I, as a 22-year-old met, 7th, 8th grade boys and girls, and then emerged from that process completely bald and terrified. And
I have an 8th grader right now. I know what you're talking about.
And then, had tried my hand at reporting, and there was a new newspaper starting up The Hill. When I got there,
which is still around today.
Still
I think
around,
it's like digital form.
Different owners, and these things it's such a tumultuous business, but different owners. But and that was actually a great experience.
Were you in D.C.?
I was in D.C. Pretty interesting newsroom. I mean, there were about 5 or 6 of us, and everybody kind of went on to pretty interesting.
So were you going out to Capitol Hill, and you were going out on the beat?
I was on the beat, pulling people coming off the house. Very nervous. Wore a tie and a blazer back then. And
this would have been like 95.
This was 93. I think I showed up in 94. It was right before Gingrich had come into power. I still remember that because it was such a historical event when they took over the House.
He kind of changed the game. I was just reading some article about the way Gingrich engaged the media in the way that no one else did. And he was sort of coming out, and he realized if they want to talk to me, so I can just get my message out. I'm just going to come out here at 6 p.m. every day and
hold these meetings and gatherings. And he spent a lot of time on communication. And then it was interesting because then I was always seen as, you're the Capitol Hill reporter, and it actually put me a little bit in handcuffs or in constraints, because I kind of that was the job I got, and I was interested in it, but I was always kind of drawn to these more offbeat stories, and I was not a very good reporter in some ways. I was much more of a kind of a storyteller the way my grandmother used to tell me stories. So I would kind of tell a story from beginning to end, and then when I would write a story, the editor would say, this is really good, but we're going to take the last paragraph and make it your second paragraph so the reader knows what's going to happen. I said, no, but that takes away the whole story. You can't give it all away. There's no ending. And I remember then I got to the New Republic, and I remember I was doing a story about a Congress person, a congressman that most people probably don't remember. His name was Jim Traficant. I mean, people my generation. He had this kind of in some ways, he was a progenitor of Trump. He was a populist. He had this kind of crazy hair that we later learned was a toupee when he went to jail and they took it off. Until then, we never knew anyone would have a toupee like that because it was the worst toupee you could ever have. But I had learned that he was being investigated for corruption, so I traveled out to Ohio, to Youngstown, Ohio. And I was going through, I had heard that he had been indicted when he had been sheriff before he became congressman. And I was going through records, going through the courthouse, and I found a transcript of a recording made by a mobster. And I forget the names. I think it was like Orly the Crab and his brother. I can't remember. They were two Crab brothers. And the person who had made the recording had since completely vanished. He had been rubbed out. When I say literally rubbed out, no one knew he was gone. And so I start reading this transcript. And I only knew...
How did this get in your hands? Was this a hot tip?
It was in the courthouse. Well, someone had mentioned, you might want to go through the courthouse records. So I went to the courthouse and I started to go through the records. Here was this transcript of this thing. And here was the honorable gentleman from Ohio saying, so-and-so is going to come up swimming, in the Mahoning River, dropping the F-bomb every other word and talking about taking bribes from the mob. And I thought, whoa. And it was really one of the first times I understood the power of archives, of documents, how they could tell you a story beneath the surface, get you closer sometimes to the truth, to an honest voice than the voice you may be hearing or even during an interview. And it was kind of that story that really kind of set me on my way, or the beginning of an odyssey to try to tell these different kind of stories and narrative stories, and stories often rooted in documents that may be buried or lost in an archive. And
a bigger word count maybe than The Hill affords. Is that what kind of drew you more to The New Yorker, for those kinds of stories and that deeper work you can do?
Very much so. And also The New Yorker really was the first place that kind of, it was a little bit of a process, but at a certain point they said, okay, just let him follow his obsessive passions, because my obsessive passions don't always fit the paradigm.
Remnick was there in 03,
Remnick
right?
was there. He hired me, and I have this wonderful editor named Daniel Zaleski. And I, they were the first person to say, I come to him and say, hey,
it's a prestigious gig to get.
It was a great.
Did you have a big interview run with ending in Remnick?
I was freelance. My lovely wife helped support me for many years, where I worked out of our bedroom, with a little desk next to our bed, which is not good for one's mental health. I didn't earn a lot of money, but I freelanced because I wanted to write these stories. And then Remnick, as he likes to say, dated me. He let me do a couple freelance stories. And before the second story was finished and published, he finally said, okay, you're in. But it was so funny. I was so nervous to pitch The New Yorker. I held it up in such high esteem. I was so nervous that I kept waiting. I mean, I literally waited years before I ever pitched a story. And finally, I had found this story about this guy who robbed banks into his 70s. He used to use a hearing aid, which was actually a police scanner. And he was like in a high-speed chase at 70, being chased through Florida retirement community where he was holding up banks. He was kind of one of the great stick-up artists. He was also one of the greatest prison escape artists in American history. Broke out of San Quentin in a kayak on which you painted on the side "Rub-a-dub-dub." And I thought, even I couldn't screw that story up. I mean, honestly, you just get out of the way and get that story. And so that was the first story I did for The New Yorker. But yeah, they were the first persons where I would go into them and say, I've got this idea. There's this. No one's ever seen a giant squid, a living giant squid, but it turns out there are these giant squid hunters, and they're like Ahab, and they're spending their whole life trying to be the first to document. It turns out document one and alive, and turns out there's actually a giant squid hunter in New Zealand whose idea is, rather than capture the big calamari, as he calls it, he wants to capture the baby, just like about the size of a cricket, and grow it in captivity. And he's down in New Zealand, and they say, okay, God bless, go.
Is that true? No one's ever seen a giant squid?
Back when I was doing the story, no one had no scientists. They knew they existed. Yeah. Because dead ones had been seen floating on the surface of the sea or washed up on shore, and they were part of literature and myth that you could in Melville.
Like the drawings
oh my
of
God,
ships
20,000 leagues under the sea with a submarine, and so there were these myths of them, and they knew they weren't a myth. They knew they were real. They're the largest vertebrates on Earth. They have the largest, most complex eyes, they're like the size of hood caps. They have tentacles that stretch as long as a school bus, and yet nobody had ever documented one alive. And so these giant squid hunters had spent years and years trying to do this. And so, you don't go to too many editors. They might say, go cover the presidential election, or there's a hurricane. Could you document that? Or I don't know, there's the O.J. Simpson trial. And I say, no, I want to go on a giant squid hunt.
So you have to agree. So Remnick has to green light it, and he says, here's your budget, or how does that work?
Yeah, he had to green light it. Now, I will say that it's a bit of a sidetrack, but I was pretty worried. It was one of the early stories I did at the New Yorker, and I was behind on my schedule, and you have to produce a certain number of words and articles a year. And so I was desperate to find an idea for a story. And it was a friend who finally said, well, why don't you hunt for the giant squid? And turns out they're actually real. And when I went into that meeting with Remnick, I made the mistake of probably overselling the story, because I said, look, he's gonna capture this baby, and he's gonna grow it in captivity, and I will be the first to ever, and a reporter, to document this. I'll even bring back a photograph. And he said, okay, go. And then when I got out there, I thought my giant squid hunter was going to have this big kind of Jacques Cousteau-like vessel. And it turned out he had bankrupted himself looking for the giant squid. And all he had was the skiff. I don't remember, it was 16 feet, 18 feet, I don't know. Had an outboard motor on it. And his only crew was his graduate student who got seasick and me. And then he learns to me and he says, I should warn you, mate, there's a wee bit of a hurricane coming our way. And he wasn't kidding. There was literally a hurricane coming our way, and all the power was out on the island. And I thought, well, we'll wait it out. He said, no, we can't wait it out. Apparently, giant squid only hatch their babies during this time of season. So if we didn't go, he'd miss his chance. So we head off, and I can tell the rest of the story. But it was a disaster.
Like literally the outboard motor with your hand on it, not even.
No, he had a wheel.
Okay.
It had a steering wheel. And it just was one thing after the other. And then he starts to launch the boat as the sun's going down. And I say, well, the sun's going down. We can't go at night. And he said, oh no. Well, giant squid only they raise in the water column to feed at night, so we have to go at night. And it was a crazy story. But in that first story, it was like such a disaster story that I thought I was going to actually lose my career, because we went out there. First of all, we get out there, and he says there's some buoys in front of us marking the channel. And he points to one of them. He says, what color is that to me? Now, I'm already kind of blind myself. And I said, well, it's green. Can't you see it? And he said, and he was deaf in one ear from a diving accident. He said, I'm not just deaf, mate. I'm also colorblind.
Oh, my God.
And then he starts leading through the channel. And all I can see in front of us is this huge wall of water. And he starts aiming in between these rocks. And our little skiff is going like this. And I had a flashlight he gave me. And there was about a 20-foot water. I'm not exaggerating. 20-foot wall of water in front of our skiff, about a 20-foot wall behind us. Our little boat is going like this. And he looks at me and says, you won't find this in New York, will you, mate? And I literally looked at our captain. And
was he not panicking, or
he seemed cool and as happy as could be. And I will say privately, I was like, I don't know if my captain is fully in command of all his faculties. I'm not kidding. But he managed to get us through there. And we spent days and days, searching for this baby, dropping this trap. And it actually ended up teaching me something really powerful and fundamental about reporting. It was actually one of the most important experiences I had, which is we went on night after night trying to capture this baby. He put me to work. We go from sundown till sun up, pulling up the trap. There was nothing ever there. And then one morning, it was about 3 a.m. We're pulling up the trap. And the graduate student looks at the trap and he says, I think that's your dream squid. And the giant squid hunter put his eye right up to the container, and he says, oh my God. And I could see it too. It was only about this, again, it was about the size of a cricket, but you could see, I thought I could see its big eye, its little mantle, and we had to transfer it to another container. And as we're transferring, it was still really rough out. We were really tired. It suddenly disappeared. And the giant squid hunter had a look of utter despair on his face. He fell back. And all I could think in that moment is, I'm dead. I'm dead. My career is completely over. I was like, what kind of story is this? Even back then, in those more flush times, persuading your editor to send you to New Zealand for 3 weeks to capture giant squid was not really a financial plan. And I thought, what, we had the giant squid and then we lost it? And I really thought I had no story. And it was only later when I realized, I was like, oh, wait a second. That is the story. Yeah. And I had concocted this fairy tale notion, of catching this baby and growing. And this was a story about a man who was entirely obsessed, who had finally captured his grail and then let it slip between his fingers. And that was so much more powerful and moving. And so,
very Hemingway-ish.
Yeah. And it really taught me something about truth, that truth can be more interesting in fiction, but also to always be open, keep your eyes open, because so often we go into stories and we kind of think this is where it's going to go, and it may go somewhere entirely else. And if you're not open-minded, you may miss the greatness of the story.
You are a great storyteller, not only in print but in audio. Have you ever thought about doing the audio for your books?
No, I never had. There's so many good Audible readers now. I'm a big. I love Audible books. I mean, I had Don Graham did the Wage, and he's such a great reader. I mean, some of these, Will Patton has read some of them. I can't read like that. So
it is like it's a craft unto itself, and there are people who are very skilled at it. But you have a good voice. You're a great storyteller. I'm just saying, consider it for the next one, maybe.
I did read, I think I read the very beginning of one of my, I think they had me read the acknowledgement and the sources for the Wage, or just the end note coming from the author, and but I think that was enough for me. But there are some great readers out there, and it's funny. I really, I read. I'm very tactile. I do so much research where you have got to have the books and the manuscripts. But I also love Audible books. I mean, it's such an old-fashioned form of story. Like my grandmother used to tell me stories. That was my first introduction to stories.
It's weird for me. As a reader of books, I always have the physical book.
Yeah.
But I do listen to a lot of podcasts. But I've never done an audiobook for whatever reason. The books I just do this way.
Yeah, I do both. And partly because I'm so busy too, and because I have to do so much research, and I love certain things. So I love detective fiction. It's kind of just put on an Audible detective.
Like the old school
anything,
Dashiell Hammett
you name
stuff?
It, I'll do everything. I'll do Louise Penny, Chandler, you name it. Any detective fiction I'll read or listen to.
All right, so we're fast forward. So 2003, you start at the New Yorker.
Don't ever have me do a story. I just go on sidetracks. I'm not a...
No, this is great. I'm loving it. And by the way, it's no wonder the New Yorker has such a reputation. Talking to Bill Finnegan, living in sub-zero temperatures at altitude to figure out how these crazy people are living, and you nearly dying in some standing wave.
There's something
great
about
stuff.
Immersive. I think the narrative storytelling, you really do have to immerse yourself as much as possible, I think.
You have dreams about it?
Too much so. And you have conversations with the people you write about. I mean, that could be a little weird after a while, because unfortunately I'm working on my books for 5 years, and you interrogate them. I mean, because sometimes they're doing something really foolish, and you're like, and you do know the end, and you're like, for the Lost City of Z, where the explorer took his son with him on this trip to look for this lost city and ended up disappearing. I said, why are you taking your oldest son with you? He doesn't know what. I had a little kid at the time. Of course, then I went on a trip myself, so I'm stupid too. We're all dumb.
Well, that's perfect segue. So I want to talk about the Lost City of Z next. So this is your 2009 debut. You've been at New Yorker for 6 years now. Knopf Doubleday. So you're in the PRH home, although I don't know if the mergers at all happened at that time.
I don't think the merger had happened yet. Yeah. For the first one.
And you're not a star yet. So it comes out, but it gets such great word of mouth, as I mentioned in the intro, that it climbs its way up to #1 on the best seller list. So what was it like for you, getting to sort of the personal, your wife is helping pay the bills, but all of a sudden you watch this book start climbing to #1 and have this huge run?
Yeah, I know writers who are confident. I am not one. I'm not confident about the sentence I write, the story subject I'm working on. I'm not confident during the 5 years which I work on the. And when they come out, I don't know. You're kind of terrified. I mean, you're worried that you spent all that time, and is anyone going to come? Is it just going to disappear into a little stream? And so,
it took you 5 years to do it.
The
Lost City of
Z, not quite as long, because I did part of it for the magazine first. So I had some built-in advantage. Probably take about 3.5 years, that one, and the other two have taken 5.
So you got your first installment of the advance, and then it was 3.5 years. Were you nervous this was all going to come together? Was your publisher pushing you?
I juggled some magazine writing on the side, although I'm not good at that. I'll say where I really felt that was, and we'll probably talk about that later, was with Killers of the Flower Moon, because it just kept going on and on, the research.
Yeah.
And that's where you're really getting worried about, you do have children, and you do have to get some food on the table.
We definitely will talk about that. Actually, let's in a second. But so as it's climbing the charts, it hits #1, and then you're feeling some confidence, some goodness.
You feel relieved. And you are really surprised when
you're so modest. By the way, you're completely dominating. Like there's no one in nonfiction. You're the star of nonfiction right now. It's amazing.
I don't know. I don't know if you ever, it's not really imposter syndrome, but I don't think you ever quite lose that sense. And I also think that's what makes you hustle too and makes you work hard. It always makes you chase the extra fact. But the fact, I'll tell you where the thrill really came is when I was at a book event and I realized I'd never done this before. You write an article. I've been doing magazine work and journalism for many, many years before I did the book. And then someone came to me in the book and they said, sign your name. I was like, you want my name in the book? And I didn't know what to write. I was like, do I write your name? What do you do? And I will say that was such a thrill, and I've never lost that sense of thrill that somebody is interested enough in this book, this thing that you worked on. And that was when I first had a sense of oh, wow, that's something.
Yeah. I guess, there's probably something you grounded out for many years and you have an appreciation. I do worry about people who reach stardom. You talk about child actors or something and there's just nothing to ground them when they hit a huge amount of stardom at in their teens or early 20s. When you hit it in your 40s, maybe there's a little more because you're so grounded and humble and...
Yeah, and there was a lot of failure along the way.
And dues,
a lot of failure, a lot of, I don't want to say frustration, but, my dream was to be a novelist and I completely washed out. And then I became a reporter. And then I really wanted to do narrative reporting, and it took me a long time to get any opportunity where anyone would let me kind of do that and to kind of find my way and kind of learn the skills and do the reps to do it. And so, my wife, when I really decided I wanted to do narrative writing and I was going to leave the New Republic because I didn't want to just cover Capitol Hill and everybody just wanted me to cover politics. And I said, no, I want to do these other stories. My wife, Kira, who's lovely and is a journalist, said, I'll help support you. And, I didn't make a lot of money, but I did the stories I want. And then they became my calling cards.
What kind of journalist is she?
She does documentaries, and she runs a place called Retro Report, but she used to work at CBS for many, many years as a producer. Super talented.
That's the high quality stuff there. CBS, especially, in that, in 60 Minutes was at its prime, doing great stuff.
She worked at 60 Minutes doing great stuff for many years.
What years was she at 60?
Oh boy! Well, when I met her, she was there was 62. So early on we were dating, and then we got married. She worked at 60 Minutes too when there was the two, and then she later went to 60 Minutes. So that would have been around 1999, 2000, those early aughts.
Wow!
She was there. And
Mike Wallace was still in the chair. There?
I don't think Mike Wallace was still there, but Bradley was still around. So many of the old kind of legends were around, and she's my first editor. And just again another little side story, but. I have what I call the God No file. And the God No file is every time I finish a chapter, my first reader is my wife, Kira. And I will very nervously, again, not the man of huge confidence, will bring my manuscript to her and hand it to her to read. And I tend to get lost in the research. So let's say for the Amazon River, I probably spent months researching how the river flows and the currents and the exact elevation and where the water will twist and turn. Or for the wager, I spent, thousands of words writing how you built the ship and make the ship and where each bit of food goes. And so she'll be reading and I'll kind of stand off to the side where she can't see me. And I just
You're actually watching her
read it. I watch her read it on the couch going, does she like it? Does she not like it? And then I'll inevitably there comes a point where I hear, oh God, no. and that's where I've gone down into the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And I've written, 10,000 words on some arcane subject, like literally the building of the ship, the wager, whatever it may be. And those 10,000 words get quietly, not so quietly excised out and then distilled into the most pristine, hopefully impeccable 500 words. So I have the God Knows file. I quite do. I literally have a God Knows file filled with great stuff, I might add.
God,
but, hasn't made it past my wife yet.
My wife is also my most unsparing reader, and she'll just circle stuff with a red pen and a line boring written in the sideline. Or this one book, she's like, stop saying Prussia and Bolsheviks. Nobody knows what those things are. And if you're going to say it, you better explain it very clearly up front,
Oh my God, with the wager, because nautical terminology, that was her. And everything. I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. What's that nautical term? So you can explain it or get rid of it. Nobody knows that. That's 18th century. It's archaic. It's not.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. You can always trust better to our wives than, somebody outside the house.
You need it. We all need it as writers.
Yeah. All right, so let's fast forward to '09, or not '09, Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yes.
So here, I read, I think you went on location doing a million interviews in Osage, and then it was 5 or 6 years, I thought I read.
It really was probably 6. I like to say half a decade, and my wife, who's fact checks me, says it was 6 years. So I like to feel better about myself.
One question on titles here, because you and I were talking about the conversation with Larson, Eric Larson on titles. Killers of the Flower Moon, great title, so great the movie keeps it. Where did the title come from?
It's interesting. Titles for me are really actually hard. The Lost City to See was the one that was so obviously the title. That was the only one I knew right away. All the rest I struggle with. And I'd say for Killers of the Flower Moon, and I always want the title early on. I just somehow in my head need it. And for the Killers of the Flower Moon, I did not have a title. I just kept writing lists of words and phrases. Half of them became chapter titles. Mm-hmm. And I kept going through it, and I just couldn't think of a title. I really didn't want some kind of pulpy crime, true crime, blood on the plains or something. I just really wanted nothing to do. And I thought it was really important. And the first third of that book is really anchored in the Osage perspective and the perspective of this woman, Molly Burkhart, whose family is being murdered for their oil money. And so I really wanted something anchored in Osage. So, you're always reading, you're just writing phrases and terms. And there was a wonderful book by an Osage writer named John Joseph Matthews about the different moons of the Osage. And each month had a different moon. And the month of May, he said the Osage referred to as the kind of little flower-killing moon, because it was during that time that on the prairie, all these beautiful flowers bloom. They look like confetti. You have little bluets and all these little flowers. And then the taller plants come and steal their water and they die. Mm. And one of the first murders takes place in May of Molly's sister. And so I thought, well, that's good. But I couldn't quite figure it out. And then I read a beautiful poem by another Osage writer, Elise Passion, and had a slightly different wording in her text of Killers of the Flower Moon. And so I started just playing with the words. And then I was like, okay, Killers of the Flower Moon. I will say beforehand, it was kind of polarizing. Some people were like, that's too many words and I can never get it. And they would say the flower, the moon, the kill. And but it was one I felt very strongly about and stubbornly stuck with.
It works. So was there a conversation with Scorsese and Dicaprio about titling the movie the same way? Or
if it was, I was not privy to it, but I was very happy they kept the title.
Yeah. Well, and they were, in the movie, they were faithful to the history, made some tweaks to the book. I mean, you don't have to do both. You can take a different angle than the book takes, which I think they did in a way and as a matter of emphasis, but remained faithful to history.
Yeah, I thought they did a good job remaining faithful. I spent much of my life having work, optioned and never made into movies. Decades would go by and nothing was ever made. But I've had some fortune now where some of these projects have been developed. And the more I've watched that, as I realize, early on, I was never involved in film. I like films, but you don't realize, I think, as a general person, what a different medium it is unless you kind of really witness it up close. And it really is. It's a visual medium. I'm working on two-dimensional spaces. I'm working on dusty documents. I'm reading on records. There are places I can never go in a historical account. You're not going to see a lot of bedroom scenes because unless someone's describing that in their diary or, there are places you can't access. There are certain peoples whose consciousness you can't get close to. You are, your choices are quite literally dictated by the underlying material. And within that, then you make some choices, but they are determinative. Mm-hmm. You don't have entire freedoms of what scenes to write or not to write. And with a film, you suddenly have actors playing these human beings. You will suddenly have their consciousness expressed just in an expression, in a blink of the eye. I mean, Lily Gladstone, who plays Molly, is just amazing, and same with Dicaprio. And so, the thing I have realized and come to feel about these projects when they're adapted is they are two different mediums. I don't expect or even want a completely faithful interpretation. They're two different works of art. This isn't a documentary. And what you really want is that both of you in your own mediums and your own art forms are working faithfully towards these same profound truths. And I did feel that with Dicaprio and Scorsese and Lily and the entire team, they shared that kind of that fierce commitment.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a very healthy approach to the whole thing. I think I read a line that you had said in an interview, like, I'm really here to be a resource should they need me for something. But beyond that, it's a different project. It's a different product in the end.
Yeah, and I don't aspire to make movies. I spend so much of my time in archives trying to research these stories. That's what I know it's boring, but that's kind of what excites me. I will say the movies make me cool in the eyes of my children for 2 days, and then I'm just back.
Oh, you're on the movie set. I mean,
and then
how
I'm back
amazing is that?
and then I'm back to being an archive rat. So, but everybody gets their thrills in different weird, perverse ways, and so mine is, you're in an archive and you're like, oh my God, look at this 18th century document.
Yeah.
And I would also say, like, on most of these projects, I never think of them as films. I never do. Now maybe I might, but I never would have. I mean, Killers of the Flower Moon, about this sinister crime. I mean, that would not be something that I would have thought would have been a movie. And with a wager, when you find some odd story about an 18th century shipwreck. So it doesn't occur to me. But the things that thrill me are more finding these stories and researching them.
Well, you do have a knack for what is going to make a great story, and then obviously able to tell it. And speaking of lending itself to film, though, I did write down, you've had a number of things adapted. Obviously, Killers of the Flower Moon most recently as a 23 film, but Lost City of Z in 16, Dark Crimes from some of your other writings in 16, The Old Man and the Gun, and Trial by Fire, both in 2018. So you've had a number of projects hit the screen.
Yeah, I laugh because honestly, for like 20 years, someone would option it for 6 months and nothing would ever get made. And The Lost City of Z, I used to joke because, that movie, they optioned that back in, 2008 or something, 7. I can't remember when they optioned it, but I think it got made in 2016 or something. But it took about a decade. Mm-hmm. And there were...
Did they keep renewing? So you got to check every year?
No, it would fall out, and they were doing. And there was twice. I'm pretty sure my memory serves me correctly, but I know because I don't want to exaggerate. I think twice. Certainly one time they were 3 months before shooting, and an actor. No, this happened to us, and an actor dropped out, and then I was called. You get that dreaded call. Mm-hmm. It's falling apart, and then they spend years reconstructing another actor, and then it would fall apart. They never tell you exactly why. And so I realized that getting a movie made was harder than finding an ancient civilization in the middle of the jungle. In the middle of the jungle.
Did you ever work on the screenplay?
No, never. Nothing. Never. And and my experience, my involvement in each one is different. I mean, sometimes it's usually you always have some conversation. Usually, it's just providing some historical resources. With Killers of the Flower Moon, I had a lot of wonderful conversations with Dicaprio, who was just incredibly obsessive about wanting to learn and understand everything about the person he was playing, and I found that.
He seems like he goes deep. I can imagine him almost sort of distorting his psyche to become the person.
I got to almost, I had these periodic conversations where you get to kind of witness the metamorphosis as he kind of finds the role. And I found that again, I'm just the layman. I just found it fascinating. But I also had a deep amount of respect when you realize that people are so successful at the art and it's not an accident. I mean, they are committed. They are working hard. They're trying to understand everything. So,
it is, and sometimes you watch the movies and you think, there are a million people who could have played that role or done that thing, and then you see the ones where you're like, nope, that's special. That's a different
it's
kind
such
of
a mysterious art form to me. I don't, it's so alien. I mean, I'm so self-conscious. I hate being in front of a TV camera, so I'm very self-conscious. And so the idea that you can kind of just assume yourself and become so natural playing someone is mysterious to me. But to see the level of dedication and the way they come about it. And so for me, it was more just like being a reporter. I'm just like, wow, that's pretty interesting the way you're doing that, the way you're looking at it, and the records you're looking for to try to figure out who this. They would ask you things you would expect, like, do you have testimony about the way they spoke? Did he walk with a limp? Some of these kind of basic things, pictures, video, anything you could have. But I remember once Scorsese's production team asked me, and this is when I realized, again, what a different medium it is. Scorsese's production team called me and they said, what was the lighting like in Molly's Burkhardt's house? And I sat there and I thought, I said, they're like, was it, generator power? Was it gas, oil power? And I said, I knew they had lights. I said, I have no idea. I said, that was not something I really had to think about, but they were thinking about it because they wanted to know how the camera would reflect and show the images. And so even what they're thinking about, the lighting in a room, was not something that I would have thought about.
Oh, that's fascinating. All right, I want to do a quick bit, before we get on the wager specifically, a quick bit on process.
Yes.
How do you, because you've done a range of things. So the Wager's this 18th century shipwreck. You've done a Lost City of Z in the Amazon. You've done a bunch of different geographies, timelines. How do you pick topics? And is there a through line that you see in what you have chosen to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I do go through a little bit of a process, and even more so with books because of the level of commitment they involve. And usually the first process is just to something get its hooks into you. And that can come about usually, I came upon the Lost City of Z through a footnote. I was reading about Conan Doyle, and I saw a footnote that this explorer had helped inspire, partly inspired his Conan Doyle's novel, The Lost World. And so I was like, who's this explorer? I'd never heard of him. And I looked him up, and it was Percy Harrison Fawcett. And I started reading about it. He disappeared in the Amazon, and then that set me on my way. And The Wager, it was an 18th century manuscript in a British archive written by the midshipman John Byron, who would later go on to become the grandfather poet Lord Byron. And so I begin to read these things or see these things, and they kind of get my hooks into them. I'm like, what is this? This is just so curious. It reveals, something fascinating. Then I go through a kind of a certain rational process. So, okay, this is interesting, but are there underlying materials to tell it? Because as a historian, as I say, there are only places you can go. I mean, I don't invent anything, so I'm stuck. I might come across the best story in the world, and if I call the CIA or the FBI and they say that's all classified, we're never going to give you anything. Well, it's kind of end of the story if no one's alive to tell it. And so you go through that process. Are there the materials? And then I think this is a really important part of books, more so than magazine writing. You think about, what does this story tell us? What is it larger than its particulars? So it might be an incredible adventure tale in its particulars, an incredible adventure saga and a mystery of a missing explorer and a missing ancient civilization, or maybe about a shipwreck and Lord of the Flies. But what does it tell us? Does it tell us something larger? So you're looking for those themes, and I think themes that some way connect to the modern world. That there's a timelessness to these stories. So it doesn't matter if they're told 200, 300, 1,000 years ago, that they still resonate. And so you kind of go through all that process. And then I will say you come back to the irrational. Because what happens is 3 weeks later, I'm not sure, you're going for a walk, and what are you thinking about? And you come back to that story. Another week goes by, as you're going or walking around, or you're going to breakfast, or you're eating your raisin bran, and what are you thinking about? You're thinking about that ship or that event. And so ultimately, that is still a really important part. There is something irrational, and I think that is important because if you're not irrationally obsessed with a subject you're working on.
You're not going to want to spend 5 years with it.
Oh my God, no. Yeah. You're never going to want to do it, and you're not going to do a good job. I mean, you just aren't. You're going to get bored. It's going to be tedious. There has to be something that is compelling you along.
Yeah. I love what you say about, does it resonate with themes today or life today? And the human condition never really changes. And there are elements in your book, The Wager, that you can, that kind of history repeats itself over and over again through the present day. Those conflicts, those challenges to authority, and the way that whole thing kind of explodes after the shipwreck is amazing.
Oh yeah,
and so relatable, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the odd thing, or I don't know if it's odd, but the surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising. But the more I read history, and the more, whether you're even reading religious texts, biblical texts, texts of antiquities, more modern texts, 20th century history, whatever it may be, the costumes may change, the way people talk may change, the period may change, the way their houses look may change. Human nature is fairly constant. Yeah. And the good, the bad, the evil, the wicked, the heroic, the triumphant, it's all there. It's all there. And so you can find these stories that can be as illustrative as anything that happened today or yesterday, and sometimes more illustrative because we're able to see them more clearly. We have more records, more perspective, a little more distance. Sometimes when I'm looking at the contemporary world, thinking, well, how could I tell that story? I don't really know ways in. Wouldn't know how to go beyond what the daily journalism is doing, and they're doing a great job, but I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know how to go further. And sometimes in these stories, you can find all the extra dimensions. You go beyond the first draft of history. But you are looking for those themes. And it's funny because the subject matters of my stories are all very different, but they all deal to some degree with the search for truth to a large, certainly with Killers of the Flower Moon and The Wager, the way we tell stories, the way we shape our history, what do we leave out of history, how we all try to emerge as the heroes of our own story.
There's this great line, I can't remember who said this, but it's something along the lines of, there is no future or present, only the past repeating itself over and over and over again.
Yeah, the past is, what is it? What was Faulkner? The past is... Faulkner is not past or not even dead. I can't remember.
It's not. Yeah, that's right. It's not even past.
It's not even dead or something.
How about the proposal site? Now, at this point, your publisher and editor are probably like, send us anything, we're in. But maybe even as an organizational tool for yourself, how do you sort of put the proposal together for works, or how have you in the past?
Yeah, so I tend to write up just a short proposal because I have a lot of friends who write longer proposals. And so for my first book, I didn't really have to do that because I had the magazine piece for Lost City of Z as kind of my explanation or calling card. And then I could explain all these other dimensions, all these diaries I had not been able to yet look at, and all the other places I could go for the narrative and wanted to go. But I always have really good conversations with my publisher and editor, and he's tough. Bill Thomas, he's a great editor and publisher, but tough in the right way.
Is he? I have notes on this. You were he's been Lost City of Z was Knopf Doubleday. You've done what at Vintage? Are you seeing people all the way through?
Doubleday. Yeah, all Doubleday, and then the paperback with different parts, like Vintage. Okay. So Bill Thomas, I've been fortunate. I know it's such a turbulent business. At the New Yorker, I've had the same editors, and in my book publishing experience, I've had the same editors. And boy, do I feel blessed. I feel really blessed by that. But picking the project, especially for the book, is really important. And so I'll have these kind of lunches, loose conversations, and you can kind of tell in the expression if
you're onto something.
If I'm onto something, and you can tell when you're. I remember when, but he's great because he'll.
Have you had a lunch where it sort of got shut? You
oh yeah,
sort of agree, this is going to be pushing rope. We're not doing this one.
Yeah, where they're just like, he's kind of like, you could just tell he's not that into it, or why, and kind of explains why, raises doubts. But I really give him credit, especially with Killers of the Flower Moon, because, when I came up with that one, again, that was when I came across that. Now it seems obvious, there's a movie, everyone will read that story. But at the time, it was a pretty obscure piece of history. I didn't know if people would want to read that kind of story, that kind of history. And I remember when I presented to him, he said right away, this is it. He was the one. In fact, he bolstered me.
Oh, that's great. All right, how do you organize your thinking then as you sit down? Because you've done, with Osage, a lot of primary research in addition to the secondary. That was less archival, which I guess is a fun other way to do research. It must be nice to change it up a bit. But how do you organize all that material, years and years of collecting information?
So The Wager was obviously primarily archival. It was not primarily, it was archival. I found the few descendants, but they didn't really know anything. With the Killers of the Flower Moon, it was both paths, and same with the Lost City of Z, where it was both based on primary historical records as well as with interviews with descendants who could help share oral histories and stories. And I spent a lot of time just gathering the research. I have an office that will look like a disaster site by the end. Truly a disaster. It is not cleaned after several years. My wife said there's one room that I'm allowed, and that is my office. And I do try to keep, food out of it because food may be found moldering at some points. Very dangerous. But it grows over time. After each book, I clean it out. And then the new stuff starts to come in. The old stuff goes into the attic. The new stuff starts to come in, starts to build up.
And then that'll all go to like New York Public Library and their collection of amazing research.
Yeah, but I will say the most tedious, hardest, and in many ways the most important part is that organization, because you have so many records and so many interviews.
Do you use the software that sort of does it, or do you just have like index cards, or physically, how are you organizing?
I do it through a fairly primitive computer way, which is I have friends who use Scrivener, I think, a Scrivener or something, I don't know what it's called, but they've tried to get me. I'm such a technophobe, but I use the very old-fashioned Microsoft Word, and what I do is I will literally, every book, every document I read, I will highlight, and then I will type that information into a computer, creating a central database, almost a central library with the source material and what the key material. And sometimes, I'll be doing, just goes on. Do a lot. At least I get to listen to a lot of music. I'm just typing and typing notes and notes. But I need to create that central database because then the information becomes movable. And you can kind of manipulate it in a way. And I know it sounds serious, but what you don't want to do is be writing and being like, wait, where was that? Where was that fact? You don't want to be stuck. And then you spend 3 weeks trying to find some document and you've lost your whole consciousness of writing. Yeah. And so then I will create a central database with a central kind of sketch outline for the book. And then I will do these micro outlines. And they just take a long time. But once I have the micro outline for the chapter, it's incredibly detailed. It may be 100 pages, 150 pages. I can then just put that by my computer. And I can then just type and write, and it's kind of in an order.
Oh, that's great.
Very boring, I must say, but it is really essential, that little,
it's
both boring to talk about and boring to do.
Interesting you're but you and I came up in you might be a couple years older than I am, but we came up in the sort of 80s, 90s, pre-PC. Like when I was in college, there was no, maybe one kid had a PC or something. Everyone was on these weird word processors that, you hit print and one page comes out or something, and there was no way to sort of organize stuff, and that's just how my brain froze in that time. When I got locked in that era. So using this other software, I can't do. I actually am on index cards, and I've got stacks of them around me. And so it's definitely challenging to keep organized. But to your point, in the first book, I really was in my mind, I'm like, I know I need to keep this stuff organized because I don't want to get myself in this spot where there's this great piece that I need, but I can't use it because I can't source it, And so I had to, that did then happen one time, and I had to spent a week trying to figure out where the hell I found this piece of information, which I finally did find. But
and the fact checking is crazy too, because I fact check everything, and sometimes you write a sentence and you interrogate it forever. And I tell this story before, but it's such a silly story. But when I was working on The Lost City of Z, I had one of these documents, a very detailed record of these two investigators that had their names, the time when they showed up at the house to interview somebody about the murders. And so they showed up in the house. I knew the town and everything. And I wrote, they showed up on the stoop. I don't know why I wrote that. Maybe I was just in this kind of Western thing. So, and then I wrote it, and I went back to then fact check it. I said, stoop. And then I looked up the word because I was kind of, I don't know. I was like, what literally is a stoop? And I was like, stoop is literally a porch. So I was like, did the house have a porch? And then I knew there was a historical society in the town. And I spent weeks saying, do you have a photograph? The house was there. Did you have any old archive images of this house? And then eventually, after 3 weeks, I realized I'm never going to learn whether it was stupid. I just really showed up at the door. But it was I should have done that right from the very beginning. But I had somehow written stoop. But you do that kind of level of fact checking where you're literally interrogating every sentence after you've done it and going back to make sure you do it. So having everything archived in your outlines and searchable when it comes time to also doing that process of fact checking and then doing endnotes makes your life a lot easier. My only piece of advice is, which I've done before in a book, don't do your endnotes all at the very end. Do them while you're going along, because, oh my God, you finish a book and you're like, in chapter 2, where was that fact about the how tall the ship's mast was? I have no idea. Yeah.
By the way, to your point on spending 3 weeks about determining whether or not it was a stoop, if you don't love that, or if that doesn't even at least give you the sense of scratching an itch, it doesn't work. You probably had fun. Let's find some old photographs of all this stuff. Let's go on a hunt. We'll find out. It's there's something enjoyable about that.
Yeah, and then you think,
process.
and then you think, and every once in a while you then find the photograph. You're like, wow, I can really describe the house now. And you're like, wow, not only did it have a stoop, it had, wow, look how long it had cathedral-like windows. Ooh, that's a great detail. So you never know what you will find.
So when do you? So your wife is the first reader, and
yes, she's my first reader.
You don't even. That's chapter by chapter. You don't sprint to the finish and hand.
There's
the whole
no sprinting with me, as you discover. There is no sprint, neither in real life outdoors in my body or in the books.
So when do you start turning pages with your editor?
Usually I do about a third of the manuscript, somewhere between a third. Yeah, usually about a third of the manuscript is when I first show them and hopefully not got off, taking a wrong turn. And usually his edits are fairly light at that point, kind of knowing, as long as he thinks I'm heading in the right direction, he doesn't want to get me too distracted, which is
Have you ever had a false start where you got a quarter or a third of the way in, and then you guys just said, actually, this is not going to work?
I have taken many a false starts, but I always with projects kind of done those false starts before I've ever fully committed to them. So before I'll ever begin a project, I'll spend especially if I'm serious about it, I'll spend a couple months, really, even a few months, really researching it. And I always try early on to make that decision, because my greatest fear is to wake up after 2 years and be like, what am I doing on this island?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Last one on process. Would you ever, well, this is barely process, but would you ever go back to the novel?
No, I don't think so. I really don't. I feel like I kind of found my medium. Maybe in retirement one day, maybe I'll write a short story. There's always one short story I've always wanted to write, but no, I think I've kind of found the medium that works for me. It's kind of such a journey to kind of find it. And I also feel like I'm still always learning. If I reached a point where I felt like, oh, okay, this is old hat, or oh, this is tedious, or oh, I'm just doing something familiar again, right? It's probably why I always pick different subjects, different challenges, different time periods. I'm always trying to find ways to keep me active and keep me curious. And so I haven't reached that point. I don't think I ever will. I mean, if I did, then maybe I'd say, okay, let's try something new. But right now, each project to me feels like such an adventure, such a new project, and so many challenges within it. Both that excite me and scare me. And so that's enough.
Well, I'm sure that is music to the ears of your agent, who's thinking, David, we're doing quite well in this narrative history lane. Why would we try?
What's the story about reporters? Like, you're an exception. You've done both. You're the rare exception. For most reporters and historians, they say, for every reporter, there's a novel waiting to be born that shouldn't be.
So with The Wager, so we'll move specifically onto that. As we've said, it was different from Killers of the Flower Moon. It's going way back deep in the archives, and it also had a different experience for you in particular as opposed to Lost City of Z. Like, by the time this came out, it was this crazy confluence of events. You had Killers of the Flower Moon in the theater, The Wager hits the bookshelves. It was like, as I said, I walked down the beach and saw 4 people with the hardcover. I mean, what was it like when The Wager came out and just went gangbusters?
Yeah, again, there's the truth is, I feel it's a strange thing to say, but you have relief when you're finished, and you're so worried, are people going to like something, and is it going to resonate? And so I think you feel relief and a little bit of surprise. I don't think you lose that sense of surprise if something strikes a chord, and especially because and this is I'm being very honest. This is not like behind. Like, the whole time you're working, like, if people don't really want to read about people on an 18th century ship, when it's all done and then it works, it kind of makes sense. But when you're working on it, again, you don't know the end of your mystery. You don't know the end of your project. Each project is an adventure, and you don't quite know how it's all going to work out. So you do wonder about that. But it's been great to see. But the thing you do, and and I think this comes from being a bit from coming out of reporting, even though now I'm really just a book author, is I still remember Rebnick walking by my office after every magazine article, and I'm kind of like, yes, I just did a 20,000 word article. I'm feeling great about myself and got some nice readers mail. And Rebnick would just kind of walk by and he'd look at his wrist at his watch. What's next, kid? What's next? Yeah. And so I always feel that too. You feel, okay, yes, okay, what's next? I got to get, what's my next one?
What's your relationship there now? Because obviously you've got, these incredible books out. You probably got the next book in the works somewhere. Are you still doing New Yorker stuff?
I just did a very short thing for their in kind of celebration celebration of their anniversary, recommending an author and a story from the archives, which was a lot of fun. So I used to see myself as someone who worked for the New Yorker who did books on the side, and now I see myself as someone who does books, and when I can, I try to do a magazine.
Yeah.
But it's still a home.
So back on the wager research piece, which I am really fascinated by, because when I've done research in the past, archivists have said to me the golden age of archives is sort of like late 1800s to 1970 or so. Everyone's writing letters and they kept them, and diaries and things like that. It's just a really rich period. Now, you're going so far back that there's, of course, still plenty of stuff, but it's the farther back you go, the harder it gets. So were these all in the UK? Or
they were all almost all in the UK. There were a few correspondence and letters scattered about, but almost all of them were in England, in London. There was some stuff in Scotland. The Greenwich Maritime Museum, Kew, the British Archives.
Yes, yeah.
And, I was surprised. I was surprised by the plethora of material. And, you have these logbooks that went on these ships in the early 1700s. And
did they have the physical logbook?
They have the
Are you allowed to touch it?
You could touch them.
Wow.
It was interesting because over time it changed. Initially they had gloves, and then they decided gloves are not as... or actually archivists' studies have shown are actually worse. So early in my research, they gave you gloves, and then they stopped having you use gloves.
What do you do when do you have your phone? You take pictures of things, or how do you?
Pictures of cameras, and you go. For example, I'll give you an example. It's just kind of amazing. You go and you get a box. It comes out in a box. You do your pull, you recommend it, and you go a box and. You open the box, and literally you just inhale dust.
Yeah. I love the smell, though, right?
You just inhale dust because it has some crumbling. I don't know if it was what exactly those covers were made of, those are all kind of disintegrating at this point. And then you slide them out of the box so gently. Mm-hmm. You have pillows, 2 pillows. You open them up, you lay them on the pillows. A lot of the sheaths are now kind of loose, so you have to be really careful. And you start to read them. And they're kind of slanted and faded. They're often written archaic English, and they often have coded symbols that they would use. And it took me about a year. About a year to get really fluent in learning how to read these documents and records and maritime language from that time, so I could really understand it and not have to pause. Mm-hmm. But you can tell these stories, and they are there. You'll be reading a logbook, and a lot of it is kind of boring. There's, the weather blew this. There's a lot of the wind blew from the west at 20 miles, 20 knots, and over the waves. But then you'll suddenly get a little description. We were in the hurricane, and we couldn't fly our sails because if we flew our sails, they all blew out. Mm-hmm. But the captain couldn't control the ship, so he sent the top men, which were usually the young boys, they were like 16 to 18 usually, to climb these masts about 100 feet up and to cling to the ropes on the mast 100 feet up, and to use their bodies as concave threadbare sails in hurricane force winds while the ships were rocking about 45 degrees to one side and 45 degrees to the other. And you start to see these descriptions, and your mind just goes absolutely bonkers. And of course, and then you learn that one of the seamen actually fell off, and it generated a beautiful poem. So these records, it would take a while, but often embedded within them. And this was kind of the early beginnings also of, cheaper press and literature. Robinson Crusoe was printed a little bit earlier before this voyage, and that's actually based on it's a fictionalization of a logbook. So these logbooks were becoming the seeds of narrative because, any journey, like any sea journey, it has a built-in plot, a built-in and a growing sense of individualism creeping into them. And so you could see the seeds of these stories within these records. And then, of course, because of what happened to the Wager, where there's the shipwreck and some of them get, it descends into this crazy chaos and violence on the island. And some of the survivors who make it back to England are summoned to face this court-martial. So they all have to tell their story. And so they're all desperate to tell their story, because if they don't tell a convincing tale after everything they've been through, they're going to get hanged. And so they're generating literature. And so it actually, there was this kind of cacophony of voices and some kind of shattering or unusual, or I don't want to quite call it unprecedented because it probably was, but like, for example, the gunner publishes his account. And in those days, usually it was only the lieutenant and the captain who would publish an account. So here was a kind of, a little bit above working class person publishing his account. And he literally writes in the foreword a long preface saying, well, why can't I have my voice? Why I was there, I witnessed these things. And so you had these materials to draw on to helpfully piece the story together.
And you spin all of these things together in such a thoughtful way that is so engrossing. And by the way, I'm telling you, you need to consider reading your own audiobook. You're very good.
Well, I will say one thing about process, and because we talked about this earlier, and I think this is really important, is that we talked about, and I think sometimes people forget this, they say, well, why didn't you do this? Sometimes, well, why didn't you do that? I said, well, I couldn't. Why didn't you write more about that person? Well, I couldn't find anything about that person. Your decision as a historian, the challenge is to work within the constraints to try to make something hopefully magical. And for the wager, I had these conflicting accounts, but they're all deceased. I can't interview everyone on the ship and the witnesses. And so I'm stuck with these conflicting accounts. And so I kind of completely stuck with, well, how am I going to tell the story? I can't really be a omniscient narrator because they're all telling different versions. And so then I said, well, okay, and it goes back even to the giant squid. How can I be faithful to the story? And I said, well, okay, 3 different perspectives. Let's show their warring perspectives. Let's show how they're each shaping their story, and let the reader be the juror. Let the reader, who I think is always smart. My imaginary reader is always really bright. I won't lecture to the reader. I don't, you should believe this neon sign. This means this. No, the readers are clever. I think really smart. And let the reader be the juror. Let the reader be the juror. Let the reader provide the judgment of history. And so that was the way the structure kind of came about in the wager. But it was the materials. I didn't go into the materials saying, oh, I'm going to tell 3 perspectives. I said, no, the materials are telling me this is the way I have to tell the story. Yeah. And it's the way I'm going to get closest to the truth.
Yeah. One last question on the research and the archives, because I was enjoying the visual of you there with the pages on the pillows and things like that. Is there much of an effort underway to take some of these 18th century and older logbooks that are falling apart as we speak, to transcribe those into digital format and put them up there, and then you can kind of like even keyword search on it and things like that from your laptop at home?
Yeah, so there certainly is some effort to digitally scan. And in fact, a lot of my research took place during COVID. And so I was not able to go to England. And I hired a wonderful British researcher to take digital scans of a lot of it, so they could send,
like a photo. You can't even
just
scan
photo.
Some of these pages.
Yeah, no, they're not scanned. Digital images. Just take a photograph. But he took really good photographs and send them to me. And I've seen, and some of these things you'll occasionally see digital scans. I haven't seen them to the level where you could actually keyword search, which would be wonderful.
Someone needs to like type it in.
So that you tend to be the original with a photograph on it. But so much of it still isn't, and there's so many materials. And I always say to people, and I think Eric Larson always talks about this. He talked about that in that wonderful interview you had with him. But there's a serendipity to archival research. A lot of the things you find you're not looking for. They just kind of come about unexpectedly. And so I think it really is.
I think that what he says, and only I know it when I see it. Like you can't have someone else go do it for you.
You kind of stumble upon something, you see something, and that that kind of comes from kind of going through these materials and being tactile.
Yeah. All right. One topic before we get into the lightning round, which is what is next. So I know the wager is sort of in process potentially here with Scorsese and Dicaprio. Has he picked which role he wants to play yet?
They have not told me which role. I mean, I assume it can't be John Byron because John Byron would have been too young. He was the 16-year-old midshipman. So I would assume it would be John Bulkley, who was the gunner. Or the crazy captain, David Sheep. I would assume be one of those. But and then I am working on a new project. I'm fairly cryptic about it for various reasons. One is I used to find when I was younger, I would go to cocktail parties. I used to do that when I was younger. Now I barely drink, as you can see. And I used to tell people what I was writing, and I'd tell these great stories, and then I would never write them. And I realized if you talk about what you're working on, those are usually the stories that die in the cocktail party. And so I'm gonna, so I tend to not talk about what I'm working on too much. But also I'm a little cryptic about this one. People are alive. There's some sensitivities to it. So I will say it is about espionage, a realm I've never been in. But in some ways, I see it as kind of part of a trilogy with The Wager and Killers of the Flower Moon as these kind of explorations of the truth in these kind of realms of misinformation and disinformation.
How far in are you?
Research.
Okay, so no pub date out there, you know?
No, they might have one, but thankfully they haven't told me what it is yet. So I'm not yet terrified, which is why I'm in here talking to you.
Yeah, well, exactly.
I could get away for the day. I can have part of a mojito.
Well, I'm excited for that. That sounds great. Is it, can you say which hemisphere you're in?
No.
Okay. All right. I respect that. I feel the same. In fact, I've told a similar story. It's like you say something at a cocktail party, but next party it doesn't happen. And then you have this humiliating conversation the next year. Like, how's that book going? You're like, mumble.
Or the worst thing is then you then go to the bookstore and you see that someone else has written about it. And you're like, oh, I really shouldn't have been talking about that too much.
All right. So on to the lightning round then.
All right.
Your favorite book as a kid?
There was a book by a writer named Robert Cormier who wrote a book called I Am the Cheese. I don't know how many people remember. He also wrote The Chocolate War. And I can't remember how old I would have been when I read it. But it was the first book that kind of blew my mind. It had a twist at the end. And it was something I had not expected, the twist. And it was the first time where I just thought how reality can be subverted in stories. And so that book has always stayed with me.
Is that what age? Is that a 7-year-old?
No. This was. I would have been older. I would have been. I want to say like, was it 5th grade or something like that? 6th grade.
I Am the Cheese. I feel like I've heard of that.
It's worth. I mean, I wonder if it holds up. But I remember, it just was the first book that I read that where you're reading along, and you kind of think it's one thing, and then you're like, oh, you're like, oh, I did not expect that. And the bottom just kind of falls out from under you at the end. And it was kind of the first time where I had kind of an O. Henry, like O. Henry fiction where you're like, ooh.
That's cool. I will check it out. Not like the Gone Girl twist, unreliable narrator, but something else.
Something else.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll try it. Book or books you're reading now?
Well, interesting. I have usually a few projects going. So for research, I read a ton of history, ton of nonfiction, and then for pleasure, I read a lot of fiction. So partly because I'm doing espionage, I'm just for fun. I like to read spy books. So I recently reread Le Carré's The Spy Who Came.
He's the best.
Yeah, he's the best. Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Yeah, Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is, I think, one of the most impeccably plotted novels. I had read it whenever. 25 years ago, and when I reread it, I was just amazed at how perfectly plotted it is. My daughter was in a play not too long ago, The Great Gatsby, and I was like, I haven't read that since 20-some-odd, 30 years ago, so I thought I would reread that. So rather than read the newspaper of late, with all the turbulence of the world, I was like, each morning I'll just read a chapter of The Great Gatsby. So I read that, and I will say that book completely holds up. I mean, it's so beautifully written from a sentence-to-sentence level. Also, I mean, a short book. I mean, it's riveting, and its themes completely resonate. These ideas. We talk about, this is the 1920s. We talk about history telling us stories, and this is about people who kind of break things and leave other people to clean them up. I mean, that's a message about the human condition that's kind of eternal.
Yeah, right.
So and then just for fun, I did the latest Michael Connelly novel on Audible, and Louise Penny is getting queued up next. So anyway, I pre-order them. They just come right in. I know, okay, their new one's out, and I go hit that.
Yeah, so you get like the ping. There it is,
I get the ping. I'm like, okay, ready to go. I got to go for a really long walk.
Yeah, I'm going to try Audible Book on your recommendations here. Favorite few recent TV shows to recommend to the audience?
Not the Super Bowl. It was very boring.
I'm an Eagles fan, so I was enjoying every minute.
Okay.
Like the early big lead, it was like I didn't have to reach for my
All
emergency blood pressure medication. I was just sitting pretty.
You can't let out that we're sitting in Manhattan right now, and you're an Eagles. I am a Giants fan, which is why I can't root for the Eagles. So I can't. That's. I loved his novels, those novels as well, the spy novels, the Slow Horses or Slow Horses.
Oh,
They're different.
yeah.
That series,
Yeah, Slow Horses is
and
great.
the Apple series has been a lot of fun too. I just think it's got a great conceit of kind of. I like everything that kind of undermines the perfection.
Gary Oldman, right?
Yeah, Gary
I
Oldman.
couldn't
Oh,
think of the
he's
name
so good. It's such a good conceit. It reminds me. I don't want to bore you, but there was this whole thing when you used to read about New York. It was called the Rubber Room, where they couldn't fire certain teachers, and they put them in the Rubber Room in New York because they were kind of protected. And so there was these kind of bad teachers who were just sick getting paid in the Rubber Room forever. And the conceit for this is these spies who kind of failed out of the main agency, and they're kind of in the Rubber Room, and yet they end up kind of solving things and doing stuff. So it's a great conceit. And then Silo, I've been watching with my family, which is fun. We do family shows. And what I like about the Silo is it kind of reminds me a little bit like The Wager. I'm always interested in stories where you have people in confined circumstances, so on a ship or an island or a submarine, whatever it may be, because those always kind of become tests of human. They're like laboratories.
Yeah, like the Agatha Christie model, right?
Yeah,
like
the Agatha Christie.
The train or the island or the
and you get
Temple
to
of
see
Mist.
all of human nature play out in this tight, confined narrative, and it kind of tests human beings. But all the things they do, kind of, you could see on a larger scale play out in this small scale. So I'm enjoying this.
I haven't even heard of Silo.
Yeah.
I'll check that out. All right, this is a show favorite, as you know, least attended book event ever.
Oh my God. So there's been a few, sadly, but there was one, and I'm doing this partly to spare them, but also because I'm being honest, I can't remember the name. It was so bad, but it was in New York. And you would think New York would have really good book events, and the book was pretty successful. It was Killers of the Flower Moon. It was doing pretty well, and it was some kind of club. It was a women's club in New York, and I can't remember the name. And a friend of mine was
Colony?
I'm being honest, I just can't remember, but it was such a bad event. And a friend of mine knew them, so invited me, and I had done it. I said, okay, sure, I'll go. And so I went there, and I got there, and they had a nice room set up for all these people, and nobody came. There was nobody there.
They you're already. They must have misfired on the
book.
date or
The book was a bestseller, and nobody's there. Now you kind of think so your first thing is like, okay, not so bad. I get to go home. I'm pretty tired. I've been talking a lot. You're doing a lot of podcasts about your book, and you're like, you know what? That's okay. I'll just turn around. But no. This is why they felt so bad that then they wanted to, they felt so bad, the organizer, and it was very sweet, but they then wanted to take me to dinner, and they felt like they at the dinner had to ask me questions. And so it was kind of a 2-hour book event for these two
they put you to work anyway.
at a table. And so it was, that was not good.
That's amazing. They must have sent the email out with the wrong date or something. There's no way you're out there.
Oh, and I had a moderator came. I had to get a moderator. A friend came, so there were the two of us.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so there were the two. It was supposed to be a moderated conversation. So I felt really bad for that person, and then that person felt. So everybody just felt bad. It was just one of those things where everybody just felt bad, but nobody just wanted to say. What would have been great is just call it a day. This is a disaster. Yeah. We admit it's a disaster. Rub our hands and go home. But instead, it was a drawn out disaster that went on for a couple hours.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
That's a unlike any other answer to that question. A lot of people have a 0 or 1, but like that's in its own category.
I try to reach new lows for you. I'm happy I can share that with our listeners.
All right, maybe this will be different. The best book festival you've ever attended.
I'll say the thing I really like about book festivals. I love book events where you get to meet with readers. The one thing I really like about book festivals is you get to meet authors. And so I still fanboy, around certain writers. So a lot of the festivals that I've had the best time is I don't know if it's how great the festival is, just like who I got to hang out with. Like, so I recently did one in Santa Fe, and I got to hang out with Hampton Sides, who I love as a nonfiction writer and really admire. And in fact, we were on a panel together, and so that was great. So sometimes it has to do with that. I was once on a panel with Amor, your friend Tolls, and so sometimes for me the book festivals are sometimes if I get the fanboy with an author I really love.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's cool. I mean, to hear you're top of the heap, so that's amazing to hear. Person from history you'd most like to interview, like if you could jump in a time machine, or one of you could jump in a time machine. There
probably are so many people who are on colossal stages of history and wars and stuff like that, but. When you research these projects and books, you spend a lot of time trying to get to know people, and so there are always people you are researching that you would love to interview. And I think of all the people I would love to be able to have interviewed Molly Burkhart, in Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage woman whose family is being killed. And that's also because, the records about her life are more limited. I found correspondence, I got oral histories, and there's some testimony. But so often the authorities didn't pay attention to her story, even though it's completely central to the history. And so it's not, and I got to interview her granddaughter, was so helpful. So it's not that I have one big question or one big answer, but she was, to me, just a remarkable woman, kind of crusading for justice while a bullseye was being put on her back. And so just the chance to kind of get to know her a little bit better and just kind of be with her, I think that would be one person. When I went on I talked about going on these walks and having conversations. That was one person I would often have these kind of silent conversations with.
And that's a reflection of how deep in there I'm sure you had dreams where you were talking with her and
wondering about people.
Yeah. One last question before we get on to the final question, which is, while we have you here in the book to film, what has been the most enjoyable part of the book to film process? I know you sort of stay separate and you're a resource, but is there something about it that has been especially fun?
Look, I love movies. Don't know anything about making movies, but I do love movies. And so the going to a set, is just watching how they make these things, the mechanics of it. I mean, the way they reconstructed the town in Killers of the Flower Moon, and they shot on location. I mean, the level of dedication. I remember walking on the set into the pool room where they played pool, and they were telling me, they found these pool tables from the 1920s in Kansas, and then they're like, look how they kept score, and they had found the way they kept score then, and they had the exact same. So they found someone who had street lamps from the 1920s. So just even that level of kind of reconstruction, I found fascinating. But I think for me, the biggest thing is. You do care about these stories, and you have the illusion that in telling a story it will radiate out into society. I mean, that's why we do this. And so the idea when you write a story, a piece of history like Killers of the Flower Moon, or whether it might be The Wager or The Lost City of Z, and that story will then be interpreted and kind of radiate out in another medium, and more people will come to the story. And then that will lead people to kind of do more research, or maybe read more about Osage history, or other Native American history, or other maritime shipwrecks, or whatever it may be. To me, it's that kind of collective sense of understanding of kind of history as a kind of living organism. That's kind of a thrill. So that these stories, you said that little thing, every time you work on something, you don't know if it's going to disappear into a stream. And that if history can kind of grow and become a living organism, to me, that's the thing you're kind of most excited about.
Well, you and Scorsese are clearly cut from the same cloth in terms of caring so much about getting it right, even down to the little things, which is what makes the finished work of yours and his so good.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, last question for David Grann. One piece of advice for the audience.
Boy, I should have thought of this. This is such a silly piece of advice, and it's so silly. And I sound like I'm on a commercial at 3 a.m. On some cable channel. But just getting outside and going for walks, I know it's such a strange thing, but it's something I just didn't do for way too long in my life. I would be stuck staring at a sentence for way too long and be so committed to trying to finish it or perfect it that I wouldn't leave, or I wouldn't get out of my own head, and so I wouldn't be as present. And it's funny, I have just, in the last few years, getting away from Twitter and machinery and social media and going for a walk. I know it's so simple and so banal. It is something that has helped me both with writing, but also just kind of all aspects of my life. It just made me calmer and more present. So I give you the advice. And the reason I give it to you is because I give this advice now to my children, and and my wife, and they all ignore me. So I feel like if I put it out there now, if you're listening, kids, I'm telling everybody, go for a dang walk.
That's great advice. I'm trying to do that myself more. My wife and I are trying to just push back from the desk. At least and just 20 minutes, around the block.
Just go for a walk, get out, breathe the air, look at a bird. Seriously, look at a bird.
Less mojitos, less technology, more walks.
Less technology, technology.
David, thanks for coming in. This is great.
My pleasure. Thank you.